Why Japanese kamikaze pilots were stunned by the armor on U.S. carriers and still couldn't sink them. April 6, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, 1:47 p.m. The afternoon sun hung pale and indifferent over the Pacific. Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori sat in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, the engine trembling beneath him like a living thing that knew its fate. He was 23 years old. He had written his final letters that morning, one to his parents, one to a younger sister who still believed he would return. The letters were lies of omission, omitting the truth that he was already dead, that he had been dead since the moment he volunteered for the Special Attack Units 3 weeks earlier. Below him, the American Carrier Task Force moved across the water in formation so precise they seemed mechanical. 7 carriers, 43 destroyers, 18 cruisers, a steel archipelago that stretched across 15 miles of ocean. The carriers were enormous, larger than any ship Yasunori had seen before the war, larger than seemed physically reasonable for objects that floated. The USS Hancock, his assigned target, displaced 27,000 tons. Its flight deck was longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. Even from 12,000 feet, watching through binoculars fogged by his own breath, he could see aircraft being launched from the deck, rising into the air like mechanical birds emerging from an impossibly large nest. He had been told what to expect. The briefing officer had shown photographs of American carriers taken by reconnaissance aircraft. The officer had explained that the carriers had wooden flight decks, that a direct hit would penetrate to the hangar deck below, where fuel and munitions were stored, that the resulting explosion would cripple or destroy the ship. The officer had spoken with the confidence of a man describing a proven technique. Yasunori had believed him, because the alternative was to believe that his death would accomplish nothing, and that was unthinkable. Now, beginning his dive from 12,000 feet, watching the carrier grow larger in his windscreen, Yasunori noticed something the briefing officer had not mentioned. The deck was not simply wood. Even from altitude, even through the distortion of speed and fear and acceptance, he could see that the deck had a strange rigidity, a geometric precision that wood did not possess. The realization came too late to matter. He pushed the stick forward. The Zero accelerated toward terminal velocity. The carrier filled his vision. The anti-aircraft fire began, black flowers blooming in the air around him. Closer now, so close he could smell the cordite through the ventilation system. At 300 feet, traveling at 350 miles per hour, carrying a 500-pound bomb and enough fuel for the impact, Yasunori struck the Hancock's flight deck at an oblique angle near the aft elevator. The explosion was tremendous. Fire erupted across the deck. Aviation fuel ignited. Parked aircraft were consumed in the initial blast. 62 American sailors died in the first 30 seconds.
And then, impossibly, the fires were contained. Damage control teams emerged from below deck wearing heat-resistant suits, dragging fire hoses, shouting coordinates to each other in the methodical language of men who had trained for exactly this scenario. The armored flight deck, 3 inches of steel plate covered by 2 inches of teak planking, had flexed on impact, absorbed the explosion, and held. The hangar deck below remained intact. The ship's speed did not decrease. Within 90 minutes, the Hancock resumed flight operations. Yasunori's death, purchased at the cost of his entire future, had accomplished nothing that could not be repaired before sunset. 15 miles away, another kamikaze pilot made his dive, and another, and another. The pattern repeated across the task force. Some pilots struck their targets. Some were shot down by anti-aircraft fire so dense it created a wall of steel fragments between the attacking aircraft and the ships. A few carriers were damaged seriously enough to withdraw from operations, none sank. The disconnect between intention and result, between sacrifice and outcome, between certainty and reality, defined the kamikaze experience in the war's final year. The pilots believed they were trading their lives for American carriers. They were actually trading their lives for repair work that would be completed in weeks or days or hours. The mathematics were cruelly precise. The Japanese could not produce pilots as fast as they killed them. The Americans could repair carriers faster than kamikazes could damage them. This was not the story Japanese pilots expected to enact. This was the story that industrial capacity wrote for them. The architecture of survival. To understand why American carriers proved nearly impossible to sink requires understanding that they were designed by men who had studied how carriers died. The British had learned the hard way. HMS Courageous sunk by a German U-boat in 1939. HMS Glorious sunk by German battleships in 1940. HMS Ark Royal torpedoed in 1941. HMS Hermes bombed by Japanese aircraft in 1942. The British carriers that survived often did so despite catastrophic damage that should have been fatal, damage that was survivable only because of lessons purchased in blood. The British built carriers with armored flight decks starting in 1938. The Illustrious-class carriers featured 3 inches of armor plate over the hangar deck, turning the center of the ship into an armored box that could withstand bomb hits. This armor came at a cost. British armored carriers were smaller than their American counterparts, carried fewer aircraft, and had less operational flexibility, but they could absorb damage that would have destroyed unarmored carriers. American naval architects studied the British experience and made a calculated decision. They would build carriers with armored flight decks, but only for the Midway-class carriers that began construction in 1943. These ships would not enter service until 1945, too late to affect most of the war. For the carriers that would fight in 1942, 1943, and 1944, the Essex class that formed the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific, the designers chose a different philosophy.
The Essex-class carriers had wooden flight decks over steel superstructure. They were vulnerable to bomb and kamikaze strikes in ways that armored carriers were not. But they carried 90 aircraft, compared to the 54 carried by British armored carriers of similar displacement. They could sortie larger strike forces, maintain higher operational tempo, and project more power. The American designers had calculated that the additional striking power was worth the vulnerability, provided the carriers had sufficient damage control capability to survive hits that penetrated the flight deck. This sufficient damage control capability was itself revolutionary. American carriers were not simply ships with aircraft on them. They were floating industrial complexes designed to remain operational under battle damage. Every Essex-class carrier had redundant systems for everything critical: power generation, fire suppression, steering, communication. The hangar deck was subdivided by fire curtains that could seal off damaged sections. Fuel lines had remote cutoff valves that could isolate damaged areas. Magazines were protected by multiple armored bulkheads and could be flooded rapidly if fire threatened them. Most critically, American carriers carried damage control teams larger and better trained than anything the Japanese possessed. Each carrier had dedicated repair parties trained in firefighting, hull patching, electrical repair, and emergency surgery to the ship's structure. These men trained constantly, running drills for every conceivable type of damage. They knew their ship's structure intimately. They could move through smoke-filled compartments in darkness using touch and memory. They carried tools designed specifically for rapid repair work: portable pumps, patching materials, cutting torches, emergency power cables. When Seizo Yasunori struck the Hancock, he damaged the ship, but he struck an organism designed to heal itself. The damage control parties were mobilized before his aircraft finished exploding. They fought the fires while the ship's structure absorbed and distributed the impact stress. They repaired the flight deck while other crews pushed damaged aircraft over the side to clear the landing area. The ship was designed to survive, and survival was its primary function under combat conditions. The Japanese did not design their carriers this way. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive capability over survivability. They carried as many aircraft as possible in the lightest possible hull. Their damage control capabilities were adequate for peacetime, but insufficient for combat. When American dive bombers struck the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midway in June 1942, the fires could not be contained. The carriers burned and exploded and sank because their design philosophy had not seriously considered the possibility that they would be hit. This philosophical difference, American carriers designed to survive damage versus Japanese carriers designed to avoid damage, became decisive when kamikazes began striking American task forces in 1944. The Japanese assumed that hitting an American carrier would destroy it because hitting a Japanese carrier would destroy it. The assumption was wrong. American carriers were built by men who expected them to be hit and who had engineered accordingly. The arithmetic of desperation. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Tajijiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, faced an impossible situation. His air groups had been decimated in conventional attacks against the American invasion fleet. He had perhaps 100 operational aircraft remaining. The American fleet included dozens of carriers, hundreds of escort ships, and air superiority so complete that Japanese conventional attacks were suicide missions that accomplished nothing before the pilots died.
Onishi proposed a new approach: organized suicide attacks by pilots who would deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. The proposal was not entirely unprecedented. Individual pilots had crashed into enemy vessels before, sometimes deliberately when their aircraft was too damaged to return home. But Onishi proposed to systematize suicide, to make it doctrine, to create an entire tactical framework around the certainty of death. The proposal was accepted because there were no alternatives. The mathematics were straightforward. A conventional attack by 100 aircraft might result in 5% hitting their targets. 5 hits, 95 wasted aircraft. A kamikaze attack by 100 aircraft might result in 30% hitting their targets. 30 hits, but still 100 wasted aircraft. The difference was that kamikaze attacks required less training, less fuel, and less skill. Pilots who could barely take off and navigate to the target were sufficient. The attack run required no evasion, no return navigation, no landing. Everything was simplified to a single moment of impact. The first kamikaze attack damaged the escort carrier USS Santee. The second attack sank the escort carrier USS St. Lo.
The success seemed to validate the tactic. Escort carriers were smaller and less protected than fleet carriers, but they were still American carriers, and one had been sunk by a single aircraft. The Japanese High Command seized on this result as evidence that kamikaze attacks could turn the tide of the war. What the High Command did not fully appreciate was that escort carriers were fundamentally different from fleet carriers. Escort carriers displaced 8,000 tons compared to the 27,000 tons of an Essex-class fleet carrier. They were built on merchant hulls, lacked armor, carried smaller crews, and had minimal damage control capability. They were designed to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious assaults, not to survive concentrated attack. The St. Lo sank because it was structurally incapable of surviving the damage that a fleet carrier would repair in hours. Over the following months, as kamikaze attacks intensified, the Japanese discovered that fleet carriers were ferry prey entirely. The USS Franklin, hit by 2 kamikazes on March 19, 1945, suffered catastrophic damage. Over 800 men died. Fires raged for hours. The ship listed heavily and seemed certain to sink. But the damage control parties fought the fires, contained the flooding, and kept the ship afloat. The Franklin limped back to Pearl Harbor under its own power and survived to be repaired. It never returned to combat, but it did not sink. The USS Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, lost nearly 400 men. The flight deck was destroyed across its entire forward section. Fires threatened the magazines. The ship's captain ordered the magazines flooded. The ship survived. It was repaired and returned to service. The USS Enterprise, hit by a kamikaze on May 14, 1945, suffered extensive damage to its forward elevator. The explosion killed 14 men. Flight operations were suspended for 45 minutes. The carrier resumed operations and remained on station. The pattern repeated across dozens of attacks. Carriers were hit. Men died. Fires burned. Damage was severe. And the carriers did not sink. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed Japanese carriers, and they remained operational or returned to service. The kamikazes were dying by the hundreds, trading their lives for temporary inconvenience to the American fleet.
The psychology of certain death. Understanding the kamikaze experience requires recognizing that the pilots were not mindless fanatics seeking death. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, who had been systematically convinced that their deaths would serve a greater purpose. The psychological conditioning was sophisticated and drew on Japanese cultural concepts of honor, duty, and sacrifice that had been weaponized by military indoctrination. The term kamikaze itself means divine wind, referring to the typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281, saving Japan from conquest. The name invoked supernatural protection, suggesting that the suicide pilots would be instruments of destiny, just as the winds had been. The pilots were told they were following in the tradition of the samurai, who valued honor above life and who chose death rather than accept defeat. This narrative was compelling because it connected individual sacrifice to national survival and historical precedent. But it was also a lie, or at least a profound distortion. The samurai had valued honor, but they had not valued pointless death.
A samurai who died accomplishing nothing was not honorable, but wasteful. The kamikaze pilots were being asked to die in a manner that accomplished increasingly little, as American defenses improved and American damage control proved capable of negating most successful hits. Many pilots understood this. Letters and diaries that survived the war reveal men who were torn between duty and doubt, who believed in the necessity of their sacrifice, but questioned whether it would matter. Some wrote with genuine conviction. Others wrote what they knew their families wanted to hear, while privately wrestling with despair. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi wrote in his final letter, "I have been given a splendid opportunity to die. This is my one chance to show true courage. I am grateful. Please do not weep for me." The letter reads as sincere, but Yamaguchi also wrote in his personal diary, "I do not want to die. I am afraid, but I have no choice. To refuse would dishonor my family and betray my comrades. I will die because I must, not because I wish to." The contradiction was central to the kamikaze experience. The pilots were simultaneously willing and unwilling, brave and terrified, convinced and doubtful. They had been placed in a situation where refusing meant social death, ostracism, family shame, possible execution for cowardice, while accepting meant actual death that might or might not accomplish anything meaningful. Most chose actual death because the alternative was unthinkable within the social framework they inhabited. American sailors who witnessed kamikaze attacks often expressed a kind of horrified respect for the pilots' courage, even as they killed those pilots by the dozens with anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese pilots flew through walls of explosions that would have caused any rational person to turn back. They maintained their course even as their aircraft disintegrated around them. They aimed for the most valuable targets and often succeeded in hitting them despite injuries that should have been incapacitating. But courage was not enough. Determination was not enough. The willingness to die was not enough. The kamikazes were brave in the service of a tactical approach that could not overcome American industrial capacity and damage control capability. They were dying heroically and accomplishing little. The sound of futility. By April 1945, during the Okinawa campaign, kamikaze attacks had become routine. American sailors called them divine wind raids, with bitter irony. The attacks came in waves, dozens of aircraft at once, coordinated to overwhelm defensive fire. The anti-aircraft guns fired continuously until the barrels glowed red. The sky filled with tracers and shell bursts and the black smoke of intercepted kamikazes.
The sound was distinctive. A building roar as the aircraft engines approached, then the sharp crack of 40mm Bofors guns, the deeper boom of 5-inch main batteries, the metallic rattle of 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The sound overlapped and merged into a continuous thunder that made speech impossible and thought difficult. Sailors wore hearing protection that muffled the noise to bearable levels, but could not eliminate the physical sensation of pressure waves from nearby explosions. Between attacks, during the relative silence, sailors spoke in voices gone hoarse from shouting orders during combat. They cleaned their guns, cleared away shell casings that had accumulated ankle-deep, and waited for the next raid. The waiting was worse than the combat. During combat, training took over and there was no time for fear. During the waiting, there was nothing but fear and the knowledge that the next attack could come at any moment.
Lieutenant Robert Henley, serving on the destroyer USS Leyte, wrote in a letter home about the experience of being under sustained kamikaze attack. The Leyte was struck by 4 kamikazes and 4 bombs during an 80-minute period on April 16, 1945. The ship should have sunk. It did not. The aircraft kept coming, Henley wrote. We shot down 18 confirmed, probably more. 4 got through. Each one felt like the end. The explosions, the fires, men screaming, the ship shaking like it would break apart. And then the damage control parties would go to work, and we would keep fighting. I stopped thinking we would survive. I just kept loading shells and firing and loading and firing. When it was over, when they finally stopped coming, I looked around and could not believe we were still afloat. The ship looked like it had been through a demolition derby, but we were still afloat. The Leyte limped back to port and was repaired. It survived the war. For the kamikazes, there was no survival, no repair, no limping home. There was only the dive and the impact and the explosion and the end. Some pilots struck their targets and died in the belief that they had accomplished something significant. Others were shot down and died knowing they had failed. Both groups were equally dead. Both groups had traded their lives for damage that American repair crews would fix in days or weeks. The sound that came to symbolize the kamikaze campaign was not the explosion of impact, but the sound of American anti-aircraft fire. The kamikazes approached in waves, and the anti-aircraft guns destroyed them in waves. The mathematical exchange was brutal and consistent. The Japanese sent 100 aircraft, 20 made it through the defensive fire, 15 hit targets. 80% accomplished nothing. Of the 15 that hit targets, perhaps 2 caused serious damage. 13 hit targets that remained operational or were quickly repaired. This was the sound of futility, continuous, deafening, and ultimately pointless from the Japanese perspective. The Americans were not losing carriers. They were losing sailors and suffering damage, but they were not losing carriers. And without sinking carriers, the kamikazes could not change the war's trajectory. The engineering of immunity. American naval engineers studied each kamikaze hit with clinical precision. They examined damage patterns, measured penetration depths, analyzed failure modes, and redesigned systems to improve survivability. This process was continuous throughout the war. Each new modification was incorporated into carriers under construction and retrofitted into existing ships during repair periods.
Onishi proposed a new approach: organized suicide attacks by pilots who would deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. The proposal was not entirely unprecedented. Individual pilots had crashed into enemy vessels before, sometimes deliberately when their aircraft was too damaged to return home. But Onishi proposed to systematize suicide, to make it doctrine, to create an entire tactical framework around the certainty of death. The proposal was accepted because there were no alternatives. The mathematics were straightforward. A conventional attack by 100 aircraft might result in 5% hitting their targets. 5 hits, 95 wasted aircraft. A kamikaze attack by 100 aircraft might result in 30% hitting their targets. 30 hits, but still 100 wasted aircraft. The difference was that kamikaze attacks required less training, less fuel, and less skill. Pilots who could barely take off and navigate to the target were sufficient. The attack run required no evasion, no return navigation, no landing.
Everything was simplified to a single moment of impact. The first kamikaze attack damaged the escort carrier USS Santee. The second attack sank the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The success seemed to validate the tactic. Escort carriers were smaller and less protected than fleet carriers, but they were still American carriers, and one had been sunk by a single aircraft. The Japanese High Command seized on this result as evidence that kamikaze attacks could turn the tide of the war. What the High Command did not fully appreciate was that escort carriers were fundamentally different from fleet carriers. Escort carriers displaced 8,000 tons compared to the 27,000 tons of an Essex-class fleet carrier. They were built on merchant hulls, lacked armor, carried smaller crews, and had minimal damage control capability. They were designed to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious assaults, not to survive concentrated attack. The St. Lo sank because it was structurally incapable of surviving the damage that a fleet carrier would repair in hours. Over the following months, as kamikaze attacks intensified, the Japanese discovered that fleet carriers were ferry prey entirely. The USS Franklin, hit by two kamikazes on March 19, 1945, suffered catastrophic damage. Over 800 men died. Fires raged for hours. The ship listed heavily and seemed certain to sink. But the damage control parties fought the fires, contained the flooding, and kept the ship afloat. The Franklin limped back to Pearl Harbor under its own power and survived to be repaired. It never returned to combat, but it did not sink. The USS Bunker Hill, hit by two kamikazes on May 11, 1945, lost nearly 400 men. The flight deck was destroyed across its entire forward section. Fires threatened the magazines. The ship's captain ordered the magazines flooded. The ship survived. It was repaired and returned to service. The USS Enterprise, hit by a kamikaze on May 14, 1945, suffered extensive damage to its forward elevator. The explosion killed 14 men. Flight operations were suspended for 45 minutes. The carrier resumed operations and remained on station. The pattern repeated across dozens of attacks. Carriers were hit. Men died. Fires burned. Damage was severe. And the carriers did not sink. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed Japanese carriers, and they remained operational or returned to service. The kamikazes were dying by the hundreds, trading their lives for temporary inconvenience to the American fleet.
The flight deck itself became progressively more resistant to damage. Early Essex-class carriers had flight decks made of teak planking 3 inches thick over steel plating. Later carriers increased the steel thickness and modified the support structure to better distribute impact stress. The goal was not to make the deck impenetrable. That would have required armor plate so heavy it would have reduced the ship's speed and aircraft capacity, but to make the deck strong enough that most hits would not penetrate to the hangar deck below. Fire suppression systems were upgraded continuously. The hangar decks received additional sprinkler systems, foam generators, and fire curtains. Aviation fuel systems were modified to reduce spillage during damage. Emergency ventilation systems were installed to prevent smoke accumulation that could asphyxiate damage control teams. Every modification was tested, evaluated, and refined.
The cumulative effect of these improvements was that American carriers in 1945 were substantially more survivable than American carriers in 1942. The USS Yorktown, sunk at Midway in June 1942, had been critically damaged by 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits. The damage control parties fought valiantly, but the ship lacked the redundant systems and advanced fire suppression equipment that later carriers possessed. The Yorktown might have survived with 1945 technology. With 1942 technology, it could not be saved. The USS Franklin, hit in March 1945, absorbed damage that would have certainly sunk the Yorktown. 2 bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck among armed and fueled aircraft. The resulting explosions and fires were catastrophic. Over 800 men died, but the ship's structure held. The damage control parties contained the fires after hours of fighting. The engineering spaces remained operational. The Franklin survived because it had been built by men who had learned from the Yorktown's death. This process of learning, adapting, and improving was itself a demonstration of American industrial philosophy. Ships were not sacred objects to be preserved unchanged. They were tools to be modified as experience dictated. If a design feature proved inadequate, it was changed. If a new approach seemed promising, it was tested. The entire fleet was a laboratory where theories were tested under combat conditions and failures were corrected in the next production batch. The Japanese did not have this luxury. Japanese carriers that survived early battles could not be substantially modified because Japanese shipyards were operating at capacity, just maintaining the existing fleet. New construction replaced losses, but could not incorporate significant design improvements because the industrial capacity did not exist to retool production lines. The Japanese were fighting with 1941 technology in 1945 because they lacked the industrial base to evolve their designs during wartime. When Kamikaze struck American carriers, they were attacking targets that had been specifically engineered to survive exactly that type of attack. The carriers did not survive by accident. They survived by design, by continuous improvement, by the accumulated learning of engineers who studied every failure and corrected it. The Kamikazes were brave, but they were attacking fortresses that had been built to withstand their bravery.
The transformation of belief. The Kamikaze campaign transformed how both sides understood modern warfare. For the Japanese, the transformation was tragic. The kamikazes were conceived as a weapon that would turn Japan's material disadvantages into irrelevance. If American carriers could be sunk by men willing to die, then American production superiority would not matter. One carrier sunk by a kamikaze cost America the same as one carrier sunk by a conventional attack. But the kamikaze required less fuel, less training, and less sophisticated equipment. This logic was superficially compelling. In practice, it collapsed against the reality that American carriers did not sink easily and that trading pilots for temporary damage was not sustainable. The Japanese burned through their pilot corps, pursuing a tactic that could not achieve strategic objectives. By May 1945, Japan had committed over 3,800 kamikaze sorties. These attacks sank approximately 40 American ships, most of them destroyers and smaller vessels. Not a single fleet carrier was sunk by kamikaze attack. The disparity between effort and result was staggering. Japan sacrificed thousands of pilots, men who could have been valuable in defensive operations, men who represented years of training investment, for tactical victories that did not alter the strategic situation. American forces continued to advance. American carriers continued to launch strikes. The kamikazes died in enormous numbers and accomplished nothing that affected the war's outcome. For American sailors, the transformation was different. They learned that discipline and training could overcome fanaticism, that proper engineering could mitigate suicidal determination, that systems designed for survivability would survive even when individual components were destroyed. The lessons were bought with blood. Thousands of American sailors died during kamikaze attacks, but the lessons held. The fleet did not break. Operations continued. The advance toward Japan did not slow. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet during the Okinawa campaign, wrote in his after-action report, "The kamikaze is a formidable weapon psychologically, but limited strategically. Our ships can absorb tremendous punishment and remain operational. Our damage control capabilities exceed anything the enemy anticipated. The Japanese are trading irreplaceable pilots for repairable damage. This is not a sustainable exchange for them." Spruance's assessment was clinically accurate, but it did not capture the emotional cost of being under sustained kamikaze attack for weeks. Sailors developed a syndrome that Navy psychiatrists called operational fatigue, a combination of sleep deprivation, constant hypervigilance, and accumulated stress from watching men die while knowing the next attack could come at any moment. Some sailors broke psychologically and had to be evacuated. Others developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to create the illusion of control in an environment where randomness determined who lived and who died. The kamikaze pilots believed their sacrifice would be meaningful. Most died never knowing whether they hit their targets, whether the damage was significant, whether their deaths mattered. The psychological burden of kamikaze service was immense. Pilots wrote final letters, said goodbye to families, and reported for missions from which they would not return. Some faced death with genuine serenity. Others were terrified but hid it. None had any way of knowing that their sacrifice would be tactically marginal and strategically irrelevant.
The symbol of armor. The armored flight deck became a symbol of American industrial capacity in ways that transcended its tactical function. To Japanese pilots, the sight of a carrier remaining operational after being hit confirmed their worst fears about American material superiority. The carriers did not merely survive. They survived while continuing to launch and recover aircraft, to move at high speed, to coordinate with other ships in the task force. They survived while demonstrating that American engineering had anticipated Japanese tactics and had built accordingly. The armor was not just steel plate. It was accumulated knowledge forged into physical form. Every inch of armor represented lessons learned from British carriers that had been sunk, from American carriers damaged in earlier battles, from studies of Japanese carrier vulnerabilities discovered at Midway. The armor was institutional memory made tangible. For American sailors, the armored deck was reassurance. It was the visible manifestation of the idea that someone had thought about their survival, that engineers far from combat had designed systems to keep them alive, that the nation valued their lives enough to spend resources on protecting them. Sailors would pat the deck plating after surviving an attack, a gesture that combined superstition and genuine appreciation for the metal that had absorbed the impact meant to kill them. The symbolic weight of the armored flight deck extended beyond individual ships.
It represented a philosophical approach to warfare that prioritized sustainability over immediate capability. The British had built heavy armor into their carriers and accepted fewer aircraft. The Americans had built lighter armor and more comprehensive damage control systems, accepting more vulnerability to individual hits while ensuring that hits would not be fatal. Both approaches worked. Both reflected different calculations about how to balance offense and defense. What neither the British nor American approach had in common with Japanese design philosophy was the assumption that carriers would be hit and must survive. Japanese carriers were built to avoid damage through air superiority and aggressive offense. When that superiority was lost at Midway, when Japanese carriers became targets rather than platforms, the design philosophy collapsed. The ships could not survive battle damage because they had been built assuming battle damage would not occur. The armored American carriers were built by pessimists who assumed everything would go wrong and who engineered accordingly. This pessimism proved more accurate than Japanese optimism. The carriers were hit, frequently and hard. They survived because survival had been designed into their structure from the beginning. The mathematics of attrition. By June 1945, the Kamikaze campaign had statistically failed. Japan had committed over 4,000 pilots to suicide attacks. The attacks had sunk or damaged hundreds of American ships. But the American fleet was larger in June 1945 than it had been in October 1944 when the Kamikaze campaign began. New ships arrived from American shipyards faster than kamikazes could sink them. Damaged ships were repaired and returned to service. The fleet grew despite sustained attack. Japan's pilot corps, by contrast, was exhausted. The experienced pilots who might have trained the next generation were dead. The partially trained pilots who flew kamikaze missions in the campaign's later stages were dead. The flight schools were running out of instructors and fuel and time. Japan could not regenerate its pilot population in any time frame that mattered.
The exchange rate was brutal. For every American ship sunk, Japan lost dozens of pilots and aircraft. For every American sailor killed, Japan lost trained aircrew that could not be replaced. The mathematics were unsustainable from the beginning, but desperation had overridden calculation. American strategists understood the exchange rate and accepted it. Yes, sailors were dying. Yes, ships were being damaged. But the Japanese were consuming their remaining air power in attacks that could not prevent the American advance. Every kamikaze sortie was one less aircraft available for defense of the home islands. Every pilot who died crashing into a destroyer was one less pilot available to oppose the anticipated invasion of Japan. The strategic logic was harsh but accurate. The Americans could afford the losses. Japan could not. The kamikazes were not changing the war's trajectory. They were accelerating Japan's defeat by consuming resources in ineffective attacks. Some Japanese officers understood this. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded kamikaze operations during the Okinawa campaign, wrote in his diary about his doubts regarding the tactic's effectiveness. "The pilots are brave beyond measure," Ugaki wrote. "They fly to their deaths with determination and precision, but the American fleet does not diminish. Our sacrifice is noble, but perhaps futile. We are throwing away our youth to delay the inevitable, rather than to prevent it." Ugaki continued to order kamikaze attacks because there were no alternatives, and because stopping would have meant admitting that the thousands who had already died had died for nothing. The sunk cost fallacy operated at strategic level. Because so many pilots had been sacrificed, the attacks had to continue to justify the sacrifice. The logic was circular and deadly and unstoppable. On August 15, 1945, after Japan's surrender, Ugaki led a final, unauthorized kamikaze attack.
He took off with several other pilots and flew toward Okinawa. Whether he struck a target or was shot down or crashed into the ocean was never definitively established. He vanished into the Pacific, one final gesture of defiance that changed nothing and accomplished nothing and honored nothing except the abstract principle that death was preferable to accepting defeat. The evidence of survival. The statistical record of kamikaze effectiveness is detailed and damning. Between October 1944 and August 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 47 American ships. Of these, 3 were escort carriers, the St. Lo, Omani Bay, and Bismarck Sea. No fleet carriers were sunk. The attacks damaged approximately 300 ships, many seriously. Some damaged ships were total losses and were scrapped rather than repaired, but the overwhelming majority of damaged ships returned to service. The USS Intrepid, the most decorated ship in American naval history, was hit by kamikazes twice. It survived both attacks and remained operational. The USS Essex was hit once and repaired in days. The pattern repeated across the carrier force. American casualties from kamikaze attacks were significant, approximately 4,900 killed and similar numbers wounded. These losses were tragic and represented thousands of lives cut short, but they were not strategically decisive. The Navy continued operations. Morale, while affected, did not collapse. The carriers sailed and fought and returned to port for repair and sailed again. Japanese losses were absolute. Of the approximately 3,800 pilots who flew kamikaze missions, effectively all died. Some were shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Some struck their targets and died in the explosion. A few, very few, aborted their missions due to mechanical failure or weather and returned to base where they were typically assigned to another mission within days. The survival rate was effectively 0.
The disparity between casualty rates is revealing. Americans suffered roughly 5,000 killed in kamikaze attacks. Japanese suffered approximately 3,800 killed flying kamikaze missions. The exchange ratio was nearly 1-to-1 in terms of lives lost. But the American deaths represented a small fraction of American naval personnel, while Japanese deaths represented nearly the entirety of the remaining trained pilot corps. More significantly, American deaths did not prevent American ships from completing their missions. Japanese deaths did not accomplish the strategic objective of stopping the American advance. The exchange was nearly equal in lives, but catastrophically unequal in strategic effect. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese naval officers revealed a consistent theme. They had not understood how resilient American carriers were until it was too late to adjust tactics. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who survived the war, stated in interviews that Japanese intelligence had systematically underestimated American damage control capabilities. "We thought carriers were fragile," Fuchida said. "We thought a bomb hit would cripple them, that fire would destroy them. We learned too late that American carriers were built to survive. By the time we understood this, we had committed thousands of pilots to a tactic that could not work against ships designed to withstand it." The epilogue of steel. Stand on the deck of a preserved Essex-class carrier today, the USS Intrepid in New York, the USS Yorktown in Charleston, the USS Hornet in Alameda, and you can still see the repair patches where kamikaze strikes were fixed. The steel is slightly different in color. The welds visible if you know where to look. These patches are scars, proof that the ships were hit and damaged and survived. Run your hand across the flight deck and feel the slight irregularities where replacements were welded in place. The deck is solid, unyielding, impossibly thick for something that floats. This is not wood that burns. This is steel that endures. The difference between these American carriers and their Japanese counterparts was measured in inches of armor plate and hours of damage control training, and philosophical assumptions about whether survival was possible where survival was weakness. The kamikazes believed their sacrifice would matter. They believed that willingness to die created a weapon that material abundance could not counter. They were wrong. Material abundance, properly engineered and properly deployed, created ships that could absorb suicide attacks and continue fighting. The willingness to die was admirable in a tragic sense, but admirable determination could not overcome steel plate and damage control parties and engineering that assumed the ship would be hit and must survive. The Kamikaze campaign was born of desperation and sustained by a cultural framework that valued honor and sacrifice above pragmatic calculation. The pilots were brave, their courage was genuine, their sacrifice was real, and it accomplished almost nothing of strategic value. The American carriers they attacked remained operational. The American advance continued. The kamikazes died by the thousands, and the war proceeded as though their deaths had never occurred. This is the harsh arithmetic of modern industrial warfare. Individual courage matters less than collective capability. Willingness to die matters less than capacity to survive. Spirit matters less than steel. The kamikazes learned this truth in the moment of impact, when their aircraft struck armored flight decks and exploded, and the carriers beneath them shuddered but did not break. The truth was written in steel and proven in survival, and demonstrated every time a damaged carrier resumed flight operations hours after being hit. It is the reason the ship survived. Because American ships were built to survive.
The sound that defined the kamikaze experience was not the explosion of impact. It was the sound of American anti-aircraft guns firing continuously, shooting down aircraft after aircraft after aircraft. It was the sound of industrial capacity defending itself with industrial production. It was the sound of a nation that built more carriers than its enemies could sink, more aircraft than its enemies could shoot down, more weapons than its enemies could match. The sound was deafening. The sound was relentless. The sound was the voice of a production system that had converted an entire continent's industrial base into instruments of war. And against that sound, individual sacrifice, however brave, however determined, however willing, was insufficient. The armored flight deck was the symbol that captured this truth. It was protection forged from industrial might. It was survival engineered from accumulated knowledge. It was the physical manifestation of a philosophy that said ships would be hit, and ships would survive, and ships would continue fighting. The kamikazes struck the armor and died. The armor held, and the ships sailed on. In the end, the kamikaze campaign demonstrated what the entire Pacific War demonstrated: that industrial capacity, properly mobilized, creates military capability that cannot be overcome by courage alone. That democracy's distributed power structure can outproduce autocracy's concentrated control. That a nation of ordinary citizens trained to build and repair and fight can defeat an empire of warriors who value death over adaptation. The kamikaze pilots were stunned by the armor on American carriers because the armor represented a worldview they had not been taught to imagine. The armor said that survival was possible, that sacrifice did not require death,
that nations could protect their sailors with engineering rather than demand their sailors protect the nation with willingness to die. The armor was foreign to everything the kamikazes had been taught about honor and war and the relationship between the two. And the armor held. Through 4,000 attacks, through hundreds of hits, through months of sustained assault, the armor held. The carriers survived. The advance continued. The war ended not with Japanese victory purchased through sacrifice, but with Japanese surrender forced by mathematics. The flight decks are quiet now. The guns are silent. The kamikazes are gone, their sacrifice remembered, but their cause defeated. The carriers remain, preserved as monuments to the idea that survival is not weakness, but wisdom, that engineering can overcome fanaticism, that steel, properly deployed, speaks louder than courage. The armor held. That is the story. The armor held, and the ships sailed on, and the war was won by those who built to survive, rather than those who chose to die. The truth is written in 3 inches of steel plate, covered by 2 inches of teak. The truth endures in the ships that absorbed death and continued fighting. The truth echoes in the silence, where once there was the sound of anti-aircraft fire destroying wave after wave of pilots who believed their sacrifice would matter. The armor held, and that made all the difference.